At the behest of the government in Stockholm, a 20-page brochure was sent to all households in Sweden in May 2018. The content of the pamphlet provides instructions to local citizens and what they can do in case of an armed conflict. To understand what Swedish policymakers are preparing for, we need to analyze the geopolitics of Sweden. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Located in Scandinavia, the Kingdom of Sweden is the fifth largest state in Europe. Yet nearly 70% of the country is inhospitable, particularly the Norrland region in the north. This area is covered by dense forests and mountainous terrain, and it is traversed by rivers running from the mountains to the Gulf of Bothnia. Essentially, the further north and inland one goes, the more inaccessible the terrain becomes. As such, most Swedish towns in Norrland are situated by the shore and rely on maritime trade for their basic necessities. Further south are the regions of Svealand and Gotland. The former was the historical domain of Sweden, to which it gave its name. The region also hosts the capital Stockholm, and the rivers of Svealand played a decisive role in the development of the maritime culture of Sweden. Meanwhile, the Gotland region, which covers the southern tip of the country, has a temperate climate and is home to the country's agricultural industries. Taken together, the belt from Gothenburg in the west to the capital Stockholm in the east to Malmö in the south forms the heartland of Sweden. Most of the society, which numbers about 10 million people, lives and works in this area. As for its economy, Sweden enjoys some of the highest per capita GDPs in Europe, with most enterprises being market-oriented and privately owned. The country also has some of the highest income tax rates in the world, which allows the government to sustain a generous welfare system that distributes wealth across the society. Moreover, by virtue of geography, Sweden has extensive commercial relations with its neighbors. The export of goods and services accounts for nearly 45% of the national GDP, with its largest trading partners being members of the European Union. This means that the high living standards in Sweden largely depends on the country's access to the European market. Sweden also shares a 1630-kilometer border with Norway, which runs along the Scandinavian mountains. There are only a handful of passages through this rugged landscape, so the two states are effectively detached from each other. As such, Oslo has never presented a risk to the interests of Stockholm. Denmark, meanwhile, sits by the Skagerrak Strait and blocks Sweden from expanding into the North Sea. Historically, this forced the Swedes to look east and establish complex relations with the Germans, the Poles, and the Baltic nations. Still east is Finland, which was part of the Swedish Empire until the early 19th century. However, soon after acquiring Finland, Sweden came in contact with Russia. For Stockholm, it ended badly. Ever since the disastrous outcome of the Finnish War in 1809, the geopolitics of Sweden has mainly revolved around the Russian security threat. In this framework, Swedish policymakers see neighboring Finland as a valuable buffer zone that places some distance between Moscow and Stockholm. In the unlikely event that Sweden and Russia found each other on opposite ends in an armed conflict, most of the fighting would take place in Finland. This security hazard has enabled a mutual defense policy between Helsinki and Stockholm. For Sweden, the alliance with Finland is the country's most important external relationship. Yet, considering Stockholm's neutral policy towards global politics, no outside power is truly planning to invade the Swedish heartland. The country sat out both world wars and remained neutral during the Cold War. Basically, Sweden poses no threat to its environment. Yet, in recent years, the Russians have gone out their way to pressure the Swedes. They violated Sweden's airspace, intruded its waters, and even simulated a nuclear attack on the country. On the surface, it seems as if Russia is merely testing Sweden's military capabilities, but there is more to this story. The Baltic Sea plays a critical role in the trading activity of the nations surrounding it, but the sea does not treat everyone equally. Many harbors in the Gulf of Finland and the Gulf of Bothnia freeze over during the winter period. Yet, since prosperity in the Baltic Sea relies on access, one must therefore seek to acquire as many access points as possible. This need fueled the historic rivalry in the region. Sweden came close to dominating the Baltic region in the 17th century. However, their hold on power diminished when the Russian Tsars conquered the region and anchored themselves against geographical barriers. This status quo persisted well into the postmodern age. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained a firm control over the Baltic coast. This forced Sweden to maintain a sizable standing army of nearly 500,000 reservists and full-time officers. The Cold War also nurtured a sophisticated Swedish defense industry, but ultimately this stalemate collapsed with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Baltic republics declared themselves independent and swiftly joined Western institutions such as NATO and the European Union. Sweden went through a similar process. In the 1990s, the country's mixed economy crashed when tax reforms burst the real estate bubble. The GDP dropped and unemployment surged. It wasn't a catastrophe like the fall of the USSR, but for Sweden it was the worst economic fallout since the 1930s. In the aftermath of the crisis, Stockholm turned to Europe. At the same time, the concept of security changed through the postmodern lens, and the government in Stockholm knowingly underfinanced its armed forces. Worse still, it outsourced sensitive IT systems to foreign companies. These IT services applied to sectors such as law enforcement, military activities, healthcare, transportation, etc. The outsourcing of sensitive IT services remains a profound vulnerability for Stockholm. For Russia, meanwhile, the collapse of the USSR was nothing less than a geopolitical disaster. The country ended with the weakest connection to the Baltic Sea in centuries. It only retained the narrow access point around St. Petersburg, which effectively detached the exclave of Kaliningrad from the rest of Russia. Moreover, the St. Petersburg access point completely freezes during the winter, which greatly impedes the mobility of the Russian Baltic fleet. And to make matters worse, NATO's expansion into the Baltic republics have further exposed the Russian link to the sea. Russian policymakers tried to reverse their fortunes with the annexation of Crimea by the Black Sea, but this triggered a debate in Sweden and Finland on the pros and cons of joining NATO. Should such an expansion of NATO occur, Russian vessels and submarines would have to pass a long, hostile coast before they could enter the Atlantic Ocean from St. Petersburg. This would inevitably raise defense spending for the Russians, so it's no surprise that the Kremlin wants to change that equation. To that end, in recent years, Russia has built up its military capabilities in the Kaliningrad exclave by the Baltic Sea. Kaliningrad hosts a sophisticated network of missile systems such as the S-400 air defense system and Iskander short-range ballistic missiles. At the same time, the local Russian corvettes are equipped with long-range missiles, while Russian bombers based in Kaliningrad hinder the mobility of NATO forces in the immediate area. Yet, most of Russia's muscle flexing has focused not on NATO, but on Sweden by means of maritime and airspace violations and military exercises. Analysts in the West argue that these measures are counterproductive because they're pushing Stockholm and Helsinki into the arms of NATO. Yet, from Russian perspective, the intrusive tactics demonstrate to Sweden and Finland that NATO membership comes with high costs. With the provocations, Moscow is essentially giving Stockholm a taste of things to come, which includes higher military spending, harmful conflicts, and a restrained foreign policy. Nonetheless, policymakers in Stockholm do not perceive the Russians as an imminent threat. Rather, Sweden enters the equation because of Gotland. From a security angle, the island of Gotland is the Cyprus of the Baltic Sea. It is the single most important asset in the Baltic arena. Whoever holds it and places integrated air defense and anti-ship systems on it will gain the ability to shape the region's air and naval activity. As such, both NATO and Russia seek to hold it. This situation is different from the past, when foreign powers were primarily preoccupied with one another. For instance, during the World Wars, Germany was fixated on Norway, while Russia focused on Finland, and the United Kingdom and the United States aimed at the Danish Straits. Essentially, Sweden found itself isolated and chose neutrality. Today, however, regardless of Stockholm's will, the island of Gotland has placed Sweden at the center of a geopolitical chessboard between Russian and American policymakers. As a result, the fabric of Stockholm's neutrality is being torn apart. Sweden worries that the strategic value of Gotland will draw the country in a NATO-Russian conflict without its consent. To prepare itself for such a scenario, Stockholm is doing whatever it can to overcome its military vulnerabilities. It plans to increase defense spending and reinstate mandatory military service while seeking to re-establish a military presence on Gotland. Yet, despite their best effort, Sweden can only do so much. The truth is that it cannot face down Russia on its own. For this reason, in recent years, Swedish policymakers have stepped up their collaboration with NATO. In 2014, Sweden was upgraded as an enhanced opportunities partner in NATO, which basically allows the country to forge military ties with NATO without actually joining the alliance. Then, in 2016, Stockholm signed a host nation agreement that allows NATO forces to operate on Swedish soil during training or in the event of a conflict. In 2017, Washington and Stockholm put their new military ties to the test. Over 20,000 troops from 9 countries, 7 of which were NATO members, took part in the largest Swedish military exercise in 2 decades. Sweden's partnership with the United States has given NATO the ability to mitigate the threats posed by the weapons in Kaliningrad. This de facto NATO alliance, which is known as the Hultqvist Doctrine, allows Sweden to maintain the stalemate with Russia. However, the policy has integrated Stockholm into the orbit of NATO to such an extent that Sweden's foreign policy faces severe restrictions. Taken all together, the geopolitics of Sweden is primarily shaped by the activity in the Baltic Sea. Stockholm may not be the actual target, but the island of Gotland is of such value that both NATO and Russia seek to control it. This places Sweden in the crosshairs of Moscow and Washington, whether it wants it or not. In this context, the first objective for Stockholm is to find a balance between the two powers. The Hultqvist Doctrine is a risky policy that could backfire, so the Swedish government must take heed not to cross Russia's path. The second objective is for Sweden to maintain its alliance with Finland, which is necessary as a buffer zone against Russia. The third objective is cybersecurity. For an innovative state, Sweden is remarkably vulnerable to cyber threats, especially its electricity grid and internet services. The government must reverse its policy of outsourcing IT services to foreign companies. It must seek for ways to bolster its cybersecurity at home. The next objective for Sweden is to bolster its defense. The country has a sophisticated, independent military-industrial complex, but it has neglected its armed forces in the past 2 decades. So Sweden must expand its military size by using its domestic defense enterprises. The country must procure more armaments for its navy and air force, and expand the size of its army. The planned mandatory military service is a good first step, but Stockholm may want to look for additional ways to maximize its conscription pool. In general, to reach the same purchasing power of the past, a 50% increase is necessary for the defense budget. The next objective is to enhance Sweden's geo-economic position in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. The Baltic states look up to Stockholm, and the Swedes can use this to expand their commercial influence in that particular region. For Russia, Swedish influence in the Baltic republics is preferable over NATO presence. So, should the government in Stockholm seek for ways to bolster its position, the Baltics remains an option. In continental Europe lies the final objective. A great deal of Sweden's trade is conducted with member states of the European Union. As such, free trade and the freedom of navigation, which is provided by the EU, is a prerequisite for Sweden's economic well-being. Thus, access to the European market must be maintained. Overall, Sweden is in a state of formal peace. Its immediate periphery, however, is in a state of struggle for power and influence. As such, the Swedes must adjust their geopolitical interests accordingly, whether they want it or not. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Credit goes to our Patreon community for giving us the means to research and produce content like this. If you want to learn more or gain access to additional perks like early access, PDF reports, etc., visit patreon.com/CaspianReport. All the funds will help to make our channel independent and self-sustained. In any case, thank you for your time and Sarol.